The phone rang at 11 at night, and Daniel Reyes almost did not answer it. He was folding laundry in his small apartment, half asleep, when the screen lit up with the name of his building supervisor. A pipe had burst on the top floor of Holloway Tower, and every technician on call was needed right away. Daniel groaned, glanced at his daughter Mia sleeping in the next room, and grabbed his jacket. Emergency shifts paid double, and double pay meant new shoes for Mia, and one less thing to worry about that month. He kissed her forehead gently before he left, careful not to wake her, and told the elderly neighbor who watched her on short notice that he would be back before sunrise. The drive into the city was quiet. The streets were empty, and the tower stood tall and glowing against the dark sky, its glass windows catching the moonlight like a mirror. Daniel had worked in that building for 2 years, fixing electrical panels, checking water lines, replacing broken tiles. He knew every hallway on the lower floors. He did not know the top floor at all. Almost nobody did. That floor belonged to the woman whose name was on the building itself, the founder and chief executive of Holloway Enterprises, a woman most employees had only seen in photographs. Her name was Vivian Holloway, and people said she never left her office before midnight. When Daniel reached the top floor, the security guard on duty waved him through without much conversation, told him the private office suite was empty for the night, and pointed him toward a flickering light panel that needed immediate attention before an important meeting the next morning. Daniel nodded, thanked him, and stepped inside carrying his tool bag. The office was larger than he expected, with tall windows overlooking the entire city, a wide wooden desk, and shelves lined with awards and photographs. He moved quietly toward the wall panel near a side door, focused only on his work, thinking about how tired he would be at Mia's school event later that morning. He never noticed the sound of a private washroom door opening behind him. By the time he turned, it was already too late. Standing there, caught completely off guard, was Vivian Holloway herself, dressed in a simple shirt with her formal blazer halfway off one shoulder. For a brief second, before she realized someone else was in the room, Daniel saw something no one outside her closest circle had ever seen. A long scar ran along her collarbone and down toward her shoulder, pale against her skin, clearly old, clearly the mark of something serious that had happened to her long ago. Her eyes met his, and the calm, powerful expression the world knew from magazine covers vanished instantly. In its place was raw shock, and something deeper that looked almost like fear. "Get out," she said, her voice sharp and shaking. She pulled her blazer back over her shoulder in one quick motion, covering the mark completely, as though she could undo the last 3 seconds simply by hiding it again. Daniel stumbled backward, dropping a wrench from his hand. "I am so sorry. I did not know anyone was here. Security told me the floor was empty. I swear I was only here for the light panel." "I said get out," she repeated, colder this time, though her hands were trembling slightly at her sides. He grabbed his bag and hurried toward the door, his heart pounding, his mind racing through every terrible outcome. He thought about his job, the only steady income he had, the rent due in 2 weeks, the shoes Mia needed for school. He thought about how easily a woman with her power could end his career with a single phone call. At the doorway, he turned back for just a moment, not to look at her again out of disrespect, but because something about the fear in her eyes did not match the powerful reputation he had always heard about her. She did not look like a woman protecting her pride. She looked like a woman protecting a secret that terrified her more than losing her company ever could. "I will not tell anyone," Daniel said quietly. "Whatever I saw, it is not my business. I promise you that." Vivian did not answer. She simply stared at him, her jaw tight, her breathing uneven, until he stepped out and closed the door behind him. He walked to the elevator in silence, his hands still shaking slightly from the shock of it all. The ride down felt longer than usual. When he finally reached his car in the parking garage, he sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine, staring at nothing, replaying the moment over and over. It was not simply the surprise of walking in on his employer that stayed with him. It was the scar itself, long and deliberate, the kind that does not come from something small. And it was the fear in her eyes, the kind that suggested history, not vanity, was the reason she hid it from the world. He drove home before the sun rose, checked on Mia, who was still sleeping peacefully, and lay awake for the next 2 hours wondering if he still had a job to go to later that day. At 7 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a message from Human Resources, asking him to report to the main office building immediately. His stomach dropped. He barely had time to shower before rushing Mia to her neighbor's apartment, promising he would explain everything once he understood what was happening himself. On the drive to the office, every possible outcome ran through his mind. Termination, a formal warning, perhaps something worse, something involving lawyers and non-disclosure paperwork designed to protect a woman as powerful as Vivian Holloway. He arrived to find the Human Resources Director, a stern-looking woman named Karen Whitfield, already waiting for him in a small meeting room. She gestured for him to sit, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reyes," she began, folding her hands on the table. "There was an incident last night on the executive floor." Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, I understand. I want to explain that it was completely accidental. I was told the floor was empty, and I left the moment I realized." Karen raised a hand to stop him. "I am aware of the details. I have already reviewed the report." He waited, bracing himself. "You are not being terminated," she said simply. Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard her correctly. "I am not?" "No," Karen replied. "In fact, we were instructed this morning that the matter is considered closed, and that no disciplinary action should be taken against you." For a moment, relief flooded through him so strongly that his shoulders sagged. He had expected the opposite outcome entirely. "Instructed by who?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Karen hesitated, then answered carefully. "By Miss Holloway herself." Daniel left the meeting room in a daze, grateful but deeply confused. He had expected anger, punishment, perhaps even legal threats. Instead, the most powerful woman in the company had personally protected his job after he had accidentally seen something she clearly wanted hidden from the entire world. He told himself it was simply good fortune, a rare moment of mercy from someone with far more power than he could ever imagine having. But as the day continued, and he returned to his usual repair duties on the lower floors, he could not stop thinking about the fear in her eyes the night before. It was not until he opened his work locker later that afternoon that his confusion turned into something closer to concern. Tucked inside, folded neatly on top of his spare uniform, was a small handwritten note. There was no envelope, no signature beyond 2 initials at the bottom. The note read simply, "Speak of what you saw, and you will regret it." Below the short warning were the letters V and H. Daniel stared at the note for a long moment, his relief from earlier fading into something more uneasy. She had protected his job, yes, but she had also made it clear, in the same breath, that silence was not simply expected of him, it was required. He folded the note carefully and slid it into his pocket, glancing around the hallway to make sure no one had seen him read it. Whatever secret lay behind that scar, it was clearly something Vivian Holloway had spent years protecting, something powerful enough to make her threaten a stranger the very same night she had also chosen to save his job, out of what seemed like quiet guilt. That night, after tucking Mia into bed and reading her a short story about a brave little fox who found his way home through a storm, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee slowly going cold in front of him. He thought about the mark on her shoulder, pale and old, clearly the result of something serious that had happened long before she became the woman the world admired from a distance. He thought about the fear in her eyes, sharper and more real than anything a simple accident could explain. Vivian Holloway was known across the city as a brilliant, untouchable businesswoman, a woman who had built an empire from nothing and answered to no one. But the woman Daniel had seen for those few seconds the night before was someone else entirely. She was someone hiding pain behind polished confidence, someone protecting a story she had never allowed anyone to hear. Daniel had no idea, as he finally turned off the kitchen light and went to bed that night, that his accidental glimpse into her hidden past was only the very beginning of something neither of them could yet imagine. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel did his best to return to his normal routine, though nothing about his job felt normal anymore. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way security guards seemed slightly more alert whenever he was near the executive elevator. The way certain staff members lowered their voices whenever Vivian Holloway's name came up in conversation. The way the entire top floor of the building operated like a separate world, sealed off from everyone else, protected by rules no one dared question. He told himself repeatedly that the matter was finished. She had protected his job, he had kept his silence, and the note in his pocket was simply a warning meant to close the subject permanently. Yet every time he passed the private elevator leading to her office, his mind returned to that single moment, the scar along her collarbone, the fear in her eyes that did not match the calm, commanding reputation she carried everywhere else. Life, however, did not slow down long enough for him to dwell on it too much. Raising Mia alone since losing his wife 2 years earlier meant every day was already full. School drop-offs, packed lunches, homework help, and the constant balancing of a single income against rising costs left little room for distraction. Mia was 7 years old, bright, curious, and endlessly creative, often filling entire notebooks with drawings of animals, castles, and imaginary worlds. She rarely spoke about her mother directly, but Daniel could see the quiet ache in her sometimes, especially during school events where other children arrived with 2 parents instead of 1. It was during one such event, a parent evening at Mia's school, that Daniel learned about a new opportunity that would soon connect his ordinary life with the extraordinary world of Vivian Holloway once again. Mia's teacher, a kind woman named Laura Bennett, approached him near the end of the evening with an excited expression. "Mr. Reyes, I wanted to speak with you about something wonderful. Mia has been selected for a new creative arts program, fully funded through a private scholarship. It covers art supplies, weekend classes, and even a summer showcase at the end of the year." Daniel blinked in surprise. "A scholarship? I did not apply for anything like that." "The school nominated a small group of students based on talent and need," Laura explained. "Mia's drawings caught the attention of the visiting evaluators. It is a wonderful opportunity, completely free of charge." Daniel felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Mia deserved every chance to shine, and an opportunity like this, arriving without warning, felt like a small miracle after months of quiet struggle. He did not think to ask who funded the program. He simply thanked Laura repeatedly and drove home that night with Mia chattering excitedly beside him about paint sets and sketchbooks. What Daniel did not know, and would not discover for several more weeks, was that the scholarship program had been created and personally funded, entirely anonymously, by Vivian Holloway herself. Vivian rarely spoke about the program publicly, and even fewer people inside her company knew she was involved at all. It was one of the few things she did purely for herself, away from headlines, away from board meetings, away from the pressure of running one of the largest companies in the country. She often visited the sessions unannounced, dressed simply, using a different name, blending into the background as an ordinary volunteer, rather than the powerful executive everyone recognized from magazine covers. It was her quiet escape from a life that demanded constant strength, constant control, constant performance. Meanwhile, inside the walls of Holloway Enterprises, tension was quietly building in a place far removed from Daniel's daily routine. A senior board member named Gordon Blake had spent the past several months maneuvering carefully behind closed doors, seeking any opportunity to weaken Vivian's control over the company she had built from nothing. Gordon had joined the board years earlier through an investment partnership, and while he publicly praised Vivian's leadership in meetings, privately, he resented answering to a woman younger than himself, one whose instincts and decisions had outperformed his own at every turn. Gordon had heard rumors, faint and unconfirmed, about something serious in Vivian's past, something she had worked hard to erase from public record. He did not know the details, but he sensed an opportunity buried somewhere in her carefully guarded history, something that, if uncovered, could shift the balance of power on the board entirely in his favor. He began making quiet calls to old contacts, hoping someone somewhere held a piece of the puzzle he could use. Vivian, unaware of the extent of Gordon's growing curiosity, continued her demanding schedule, running board meetings with sharp confidence, negotiating deals late into the night, and pushing her company toward new markets with the same relentless drive that had made her successful in the first place. Yet beneath the surface, the encounter with Daniel weeks earlier had left a quiet crack in her usual composure, one she refused to acknowledge even to herself. For years, she had trained herself never to think about the scar, never to let her mind wander toward the night it happened. She wore clothing designed carefully to hide it, avoided situations where it might be seen, and built an image so polished and untouchable that no one dared ask personal questions. The single moment Daniel had witnessed threatened that careful control, not because he posed any real danger, but because it reminded her, painfully, that the past could resurface at any time, without warning, exactly as it had that night in her office. She found herself thinking about him more than she expected, not with anger, but with a strange, uneasy curiosity. He had not tried to use the moment against her. He had not threatened her, sold the story, or spoken a single word to anyone. Instead, he had simply apologized and promised silence, then walked away. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a world where nearly everyone around her seemed to want something from her, his simple honesty stood out sharply. Weeks passed, and life for both of them continued along its separate paths, until fate, in its unpredictable way, decided to bring them together again. The first Saturday session of Mia's new arts program was held in a bright community studio near the edge of the city, filled with easels, paint supplies, and large windows letting in soft afternoon light. Daniel dropped Mia off nervously, unfamiliar with the environment, watching as she quickly bonded with other children over shared art supplies and colorful sketchbooks. He decided to stay nearby that first day, seated on a bench outside the studio, watching through the window as Mia laughed and worked on her drawing with a level of joy he had not seen from her in months. It was during this quiet moment of relief that a woman walked past him, dressed casually in simple clothing, her hair pulled back loosely, her posture relaxed in a way that felt oddly familiar despite her ordinary appearance. She carried a small bag of art supplies and moved toward the same studio entrance, greeting the instructor warmly, before slipping quietly into the back of the room to observe the children. Daniel barely gave her a second glance at first, assuming she was simply another parent or volunteer. It was not until she turned slightly, laughing gently at something one of the children said, that something about her profile struck him as familiar. His breath caught in his throat. It was Vivian Holloway. Dressed plainly, without the sharp business attire or the guarded expression he remembered from their previous encounter, she looked remarkably different, softer somehow, more at ease. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared through the window in disbelief, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. He told himself it was likely a coincidence, a woman who simply resembled her, yet the more he watched her interact gently with the children, offering quiet encouragement and warm praise, the more certain he became. When the session ended an hour later and children began filing out toward their waiting parents, Daniel stood near the entrance, still trying to decide whether to say anything at all. Mia ran toward him excitedly, holding up a colorful drawing of a bird soaring over mountains, chattering happily about her new friends and the volunteer who had complimented her artwork. It was then that Vivian stepped out from the studio entrance directly behind her, and their eyes met unexpectedly across the small crowd of parents and children. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vivian's expression shifted rapidly from surprise to something closer to alarm, clearly recognizing him just as quickly as he had recognized her. She glanced briefly at Mia, then back at Daniel, her guarded composure slipping just slightly before she regained control of her expression. "Mr. Reyes," she said quietly, her tone measured and careful. "I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted honestly, his heart pounding from the unexpected encounter. "Mia was chosen for the scholarship program a few weeks ago. I had no idea you were involved." Vivian's eyes flickered briefly with something unreadable, perhaps concern that he might mention their previous encounter in front of the other parents nearby, or perhaps simple discomfort at being recognized outside the careful boundaries she had built around her private life. "I would appreciate it," she said quietly, stepping slightly closer so only he could hear, "if this remained between us as well." Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course. You have my word." She studied him for a long moment, as though searching his expression for any sign of dishonesty, any hint that his earlier promise of silence had been anything less than sincere. Whatever she saw seemed to ease some of the tension in her shoulders, though her guarded expression never fully disappeared. Mia, unaware of the tension between the adults, tugged gently at Daniel's sleeve. "Daddy, this is Miss Vivian. She said my bird drawing was the best one today." Vivian offered Mia a small, genuine smile, one far warmer than anything Daniel had witnessed from her before. "Your daughter has real talent," she said, turning her attention briefly toward Daniel. "You should be proud." "I am," Daniel replied softly. "Every single day." There was a brief pause between them, filled with an unspoken understanding neither seemed ready to name. Vivian glanced once more at Mia, then back at Daniel, before offering a small nod and turning to leave. "I should go," she said quietly. "Thank you for keeping your word." Daniel watched her walk toward a plain car parked at the edge of the lot, far from the expensive vehicles one might expect from someone of her wealth. Another quiet detail suggesting just how carefully she guarded her separation between this private world and the public image she maintained everywhere else. As he drove Mia home that afternoon, listening to her excited chatter about paint colors and new friends, Daniel found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman he had just seen. The powerful, guarded executive from weeks earlier had seemed almost like a different person entirely in that studio, gentle and unguarded around the children, especially around his daughter. He did not yet understand the full weight of what he had witnessed, nor the depth of the secret still hidden behind her careful smile. But something had shifted quietly between them that afternoon, a fragile thread of trust neither of them had expected, one that neither could yet predict where it might eventually lead. Meanwhile, far from the warmth of the studio, Gordon Blake sat in his office late that same evening, reviewing a folder his private investigator had just delivered. It contained old news clippings, incomplete records, and a single blurry photograph from many years earlier, all pointing toward a serious incident buried deep in Vivian Holloway's past, one she had spent a great deal of money and effort erasing from public memory. Gordon smiled slowly as he studied the folder, sensing, for the first time in months, that he finally held the beginning of something powerful enough to shake the very foundation of the company he had long wanted to control. Over the following month, the Saturday art sessions became a quiet fixture in both Daniel's life and Vivian's, though neither of them spoke of it as anything more than a coincidence they had agreed to keep private. Daniel began arriving earlier each week, partly to help Mia set up her supplies, and partly, though he did not admit it fully to himself, because he found himself curious about the woman who transformed so completely inside that small studio. The confident, guarded executive who ran board meetings with sharp precision seemed to disappear entirely once she stepped through the studio doors. In her place was someone patient, warm, and unexpectedly funny, someone who knelt beside frustrated children to help them mix colors correctly, who laughed freely at their jokes, who never once glanced at her phone during the sessions despite clearly running one of the largest companies in the country. It was during the third week that they first spoke, beyond simple greetings. Mia had finished an ambitious painting of a lighthouse standing against a stormy sea, and she proudly carried it over to show her father before he had even entered the building. Vivian happened to be nearby, gathering supplies for the next group of children, and paused to admire the painting alongside him. "She has a wonderful sense of color," Vivian said, studying the swirling blues and grays Mia had used for the waves. "Most children her age stick to simple shapes. She is not afraid of complexity." "She gets that from her mother," Daniel said quietly, before he could stop himself. Vivian glanced at him, catching the shift in his tone immediately. She asked gently. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening slightly. "She passed away 2 years ago. An illness that came on faster than anyone expected. Mia was only 5. Vivian's expression softened in a way Daniel had not seen from her before, something quiet and understanding passing behind her eyes. "I am very sorry," she said simply, without the practiced condolences people often offered out of habit. Her words felt sincere, weighted with something personal, though she did not elaborate further. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Mia run back toward her friends with the painting still in her hands. "You are doing a remarkable job with her," Vivian said eventually. "Raising a child alone while working, while grieving, while still showing up every single day with patience. That is not easy. I know that better than most people would expect." Daniel studied her curiously, sensing there was more behind her words than she was willing to share directly. "You sound like you understand it from experience," he said carefully, "not just observation." Vivian's guarded expression returned briefly, though she did not withdraw entirely, as she often did when conversations moved too close to personal territory. "Everyone carries something," she said instead, her tone gentle but firm, closing the subject without fully rejecting it. Daniel did not push further, sensing instinctively that trust with her needed to be built slowly, carefully, without pressure. He simply nodded and let the moment pass, grateful that she had shared even that small piece of herself. Over the following weeks, their brief conversations before and after each session became something both of them quietly looked forward to, though neither said so directly. They spoke about small things at first: favorite books, funny stories about difficult board meetings compared to difficult client repair jobs, the shared exhaustion of responsibilities that never seemed to pause. Slowly, the conversations deepened, revealing pieces of two lives that, despite their obvious differences in wealth and position, shared surprising similarities in loneliness and quiet endurance. Vivian learned that Daniel had once studied engineering before family responsibilities forced him to leave his studies early, taking whatever steady work he could find to support his wife and, eventually, Mia. Daniel learned that Vivian had built her company from a tiny office with only 3 employees, working nights and weekends for years before her first major success finally arrived. What neither of them discussed, though it lingered quietly between them, was the moment that had first brought them together: the scar Daniel had seen, the fear in her eyes that night, and the warning note still folded carefully in his dresser drawer at home. Meanwhile, far from the warmth of the studio, Gordon Blake's quiet investigation continued to grow more determined with each passing week. He had hired a private investigator named Nathan Cole, a sharp, methodical man with a reputation for uncovering information others believed permanently buried. Nathan had spent weeks tracing old business records, court filings, and outdated news archives, slowly assembling fragments of a story from many years earlier, long before Vivian Holloway became a recognizable name in the business world. The details were incomplete, deliberately scattered across different jurisdictions, and sealed under privacy protections Vivian had fought hard to secure at great expense. Yet Nathan was patient, and patience, combined with enough money, eventually produced results. He discovered that Vivian had once been part of a small startup company, alongside a business partner named Derek Sloan, years before Holloway Enterprises existed. Public records showed the partnership had ended abruptly, followed shortly by Derek's own company, collapsing into legal trouble and eventual closure. Beyond that, the trail grew thin, protected by sealed court documents and non-disclosure agreements that Nathan could not fully access. Still, it was enough for Gordon to begin forming a plan. He called a private meeting with 2 other board members he had quietly cultivated over recent months, both men who, like him, resented answering to Vivian's leadership despite her clear success. Over a private dinner, Gordon laid out what little he knew, framing it carefully as a matter of company transparency rather than personal ambition. "If our chief executive has hidden serious incidents from her own board," Gordon explained smoothly, "incidents that could resurface publicly at any time, do we not have a responsibility to understand the risk before it damages the company's reputation?" The other board members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly intrigued but hesitant to move against someone whose leadership had brought the company such remarkable success. "We are not accusing her of wrongdoing," Gordon continued, sensing their hesitation. "We are simply requesting transparency. If there is truly nothing concerning in her past, she has nothing to fear from a closer look." By the end of the dinner, Gordon had secured just enough support to formally request an internal review of Vivian's personal history, framed carefully as a routine transparency measure required for insurance and liability purposes. It was not enough yet to expose her directly, but it was enough to begin applying quiet pressure, enough to make Vivian aware that someone within her own company was searching for cracks in the careful walls she had built around her past. Vivian received the formal request on a Thursday afternoon, delivered through a brief, deceptively polite memo from the board's compliance committee. She read it twice at her desk, her expression remaining perfectly calm on the surface, though beneath that calm, alarm spread quickly through her chest. She recognized immediately that this was not a routine request. Someone was looking for something specific, something she had spent years and a considerable amount of money ensuring remained buried. She called her longtime legal advisor, a sharp and loyal woman named Grace Whitmore, into her office within the hour. "They are looking into my past," Vivian said quietly, sliding the memo across her desk. "Someone on the board suspects there is something to find." Grace studied the document carefully, her expression tightening. "This request is vague enough to be deniable, but specific enough to suggest someone already has a lead. Do you know who initiated it?" "I have a strong guess," Vivian replied, her jaw tightening. "Gordon Blake has resented my position since the day he joined the board. This has his fingerprints all over it." Grace nodded slowly. "If he uncovers even partial information about Derek Sloan, he could twist it into something damaging, regardless of the truth behind what actually happened." Vivian closed her eyes briefly, the weight of old memories pressing against the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. "I know," she said quietly. "I have always known this day might come eventually. I simply hoped I would have more time to decide how to face it on my own terms." Grace studied her carefully, her voice softening. "You do not have to face it alone this time." Vivian did not respond immediately, her mind drifting briefly, unexpectedly, toward the quiet studio sessions, toward the patient, steady presence of a single father who had already proven, in small but meaningful ways, that he was capable of holding difficult truths without using them as weapons. She pushed the thought aside quickly, unwilling yet to examine why his image had surfaced so easily in a moment of such personal danger. "We need to prepare," Vivian said finally, her voice regaining its usual sharp focus. "If Gordon finds anything concrete, I want to control how it becomes known, rather than allowing him the chance to twist it however benefits him most." Grace nodded firmly. "I will begin reviewing every legal protection we still have in place. We will not let him dictate the narrative." As Grace left the office to begin her work, Vivian remained seated at her desk, staring out at the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond her window. For years, she had convinced herself that strength meant never revisiting the past, never allowing anyone close enough to see the fear still buried beneath her confident exterior. Yet lately, that careful separation had begun to feel less like protection and more like exhaustion. That Saturday, at the studio, Vivian found herself watching Daniel more closely than usual, as he helped Mia clean her paintbrushes at the end of the session. There was something remarkably steady about him, and quiet honesty in the way he moved through the world, entirely unlike the calculated ambition she encountered daily within her own company. When the studio began to empty, she found herself walking toward him before she had fully decided to do so. "Daniel," she said, using his first name for the first time since they had begun speaking regularly. "Would you have a few minutes after Mia's session ends? There is something I would like to discuss, if you are willing." Daniel glanced at her curiously, sensing the shift in her tone immediately. Whatever she wanted to speak about, it was clearly more serious than their usual conversations about paint colors and childhood memories. "Of course," he said gently. "Whatever you need." Vivian nodded, glancing briefly toward Mia, who was happily showing her latest drawing to a group of new friends nearby. "Not here," she said quietly. "Somewhere private, if that is all right with you." Daniel felt a familiar unease settle in his chest, similar to the tension he had felt weeks earlier standing outside her office, uncertain of what consequences awaited him. Yet this time, the fear in her eyes was not directed at him. It was something else entirely, something older, heavier, something she seemed finally ready to share. He agreed to meet her later that evening, once Mia was safely settled at home with a trusted neighbor, unaware that the conversation waiting for him would finally reveal the truth behind the scar he had never been able to forget. That evening, Vivian arranged for them to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, far from the crowded restaurants where she might be recognized, and far from the towering glass building that carried her name. She arrived first, dressed simply, choosing a corner table away from the windows, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she had not yet touched. Daniel arrived shortly after, sliding into the seat across from her, sensing immediately the weight sitting heavily on her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," Vivian said quietly, her voice steadier than her expression suggested. "Of course," Daniel replied gently. "You said there was something you wanted to discuss." Vivian took a slow breath, staring down at her tea for a long moment before finally lifting her eyes to meet his. You have kept your word since the night you saw the mark on my shoulder, she said carefully. You never spoke of it, never used it against me, never even asked me about it directly, despite every reason you might have had to be curious. It was not my place to ask, Daniel said honestly. Whatever happened to you, it is your story to share, not mine to demand. Vivian studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening further. That is precisely why I feel I can finally share it, she said quietly. Not because you demanded it, but because you never did. Daniel remained silent, giving her the space she clearly needed to continue at her own pace. Many years ago, long before Holloway Enterprises existed, Vivian began, I co-founded a small company with a business partner named Derek Sloan. We built it together from almost nothing, working through countless sleepless nights, believing entirely in what we were creating. She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. As the company began succeeding beyond what either of us initially expected, Derek's ambition changed. He wanted complete control, believing my contributions were replaceable, believing he alone deserved credit for our success. When I refused to step aside quietly, he grew increasingly desperate, increasingly reckless in his attempts to force me out. Vivian's voice grew quieter, though it remained steady, controlled through years of practiced composure. One evening, during a heated confrontation at our office, things escalated far beyond anything reasonable. Derek, consumed by frustration and fear of losing everything he had built, caused an accident that left me seriously injured. The scar you saw that night is what remains from that evening, a permanent reminder of how quickly ambition can turn dangerous when left unchecked. Daniel's chest tightened, his heart aching quietly for the pain behind her carefully measured words. I am so sorry, he said softly. No one should have to carry something like that. Vivian nodded slowly, her eyes distant for a moment, lost somewhere in memory. The physical injury healed eventually, she continued. What proved far harder to heal was what followed. When the incident became public through legal proceedings, several news outlets twisted the story entirely, painting me as somehow unstable, difficult, even partly responsible for what happened, simply because a powerful man's reputation was easier to protect than the truth of a young woman's experience. That is unfair, Daniel said quietly, anger rising gently in his voice on her behalf. None of that was your fault. I know that now, Vivian said, offering him a small, tired smile. It took years of therapy, distance, and rebuilding to fully believe that truth myself. But by the time I did, I had already built an entirely new company, an entirely new identity, one where strength and control replaced vulnerability completely. I decided the world would only ever see the powerful version of me, the version no one could ever twist into a victim again. She glanced down at her shoulder briefly, though it remained covered beneath her clothing. The scar became something I hid, not because I was ashamed of what happened, but because I refused to let anyone reduce my entire story down to that single moment of injury. I fought for years to reclaim my company, my reputation, and my sense of self. That scar represents survival, not weakness. Yet the world rarely allows survival to be seen as strength when it comes from a woman. Daniel listened quietly, absorbing the depth of what she had shared, understanding now why the fear in her eyes that night had run so much deeper than simple embarrassment. Thank you for trusting me with this, he said gently. I promise you, nothing changes in how I see you. If anything, it only deepens my respect. Vivian studied him carefully, searching for any sign of pity in his expression, finding none. Only quiet understanding, steady and sincere. There is something else, she said after a long pause. Recently, a member of my own board has begun quietly investigating my past, searching for exactly this story, likely intending to use it against me for his own gain within the company. Daniel's brow furrowed with concern. Can he actually access something like that? I thought you said the records were sealed. Sealed does not always mean permanently protected, Vivian replied grimly. With enough money and determination, almost anything eventually surfaces. I do not yet know how much he has uncovered, only that he is actively searching. What will you do? Daniel asked. Vivian exhaled slowly, her expression hardening with renewed determination. For years, I let fear control how I protected this story, hiding it completely, allowing shame to dictate silence. I am beginning to think that approach may no longer serve me well, especially if someone else intends to reveal it on their own terms rather than mine. Daniel reached across the table hesitantly, then stopped himself, unsure whether the gesture would be welcome. Vivian noticed the small hesitation and, to his quiet surprise, closed the remaining distance herself, resting her hand gently over his. You have already shown me more honesty in a few short weeks than most people manage in years, she said softly. Whatever happens next, I am glad you are someone I can trust through it. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of her confession settling gently between them, no longer sharp and painful, but shared, and therefore somehow lighter. Over the following days, Daniel found himself thinking constantly about everything Vivian had shared, admiring her resilience even more deeply than before. He also found himself growing increasingly protective of her, aware now of the quiet threat building within her own company, a threat that could unravel years of careful healing if handled the wrong way. He did not have access to boardrooms or legal documents, nor any real power within her professional world. Yet he found small ways to offer steady support regardless, checking in with a simple message after difficult days, listening patiently whenever she needed to voice her frustrations, offering calm perspective whenever her worry became overwhelming. Meanwhile, Gordon Blake's investigation continued advancing steadily. Nathan Cole eventually located an old acquaintance of Derek Sloan, a former employee willing to speak in exchange for a generous payment. Someone bitter enough about his own failed career to happily provide details confirming the old incident, along with fragments of the media coverage that had once painted Vivian unfairly. Armed with enough information to construct a damaging narrative, Gordon began preparing to bring the story before the full board, framing it carefully as a matter of corporate risk rather than personal attack, though his true intention remained clear to those who knew him well. He scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following week, quietly informing select members beforehand that he intended to reveal information he believed the company could no longer ignore. Vivian learned of the scheduled meeting through Grace, who had maintained careful watch over Gordon's recent activities. He intends to present this publicly, in front of the entire board, Grace warned her. If he frames it poorly, or if the story leaks beyond that room afterward, it could cause significant damage, regardless of the actual truth behind what happened years ago. Vivian absorbed the warning calmly, though her mind raced quickly through every possible response. She thought about hiding once more, retreating behind lawyers and carefully worded statements designed to minimize damage. She thought about fighting Gordon directly, exposing his own questionable motives before he could reveal anything about her past. Yet as she considered her options that evening, sitting quietly across from Daniel during one of their now regular conversations, a different idea began forming slowly in her mind, one that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. What if, she said slowly, thinking aloud, instead of allowing him to expose this story on his terms, twisted and framed however benefits him most, I simply told the truth myself, publicly, before he ever has the chance. Daniel studied her carefully, sensing the significance of what she was proposing. That would mean giving up the protection you have spent years building around this story. Yes, Vivian admitted, but it would also mean finally controlling the narrative myself, rather than allowing fear to dictate silence any longer. I am tired of hiding something that was never truly my shame to carry in the first place. Daniel reached for her hand again, this time without hesitation. Whatever you decide, he said firmly, you will not be facing it alone. Vivian squeezed his hand gently, drawing quiet strength from his steady presence, feeling, for the first time in many years, that perhaps survival did not always require standing entirely alone. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a heavy stillness hanging over Holloway Tower. Vivian stood in her office an hour before the scheduled session, reviewing the short statement she had prepared with Grace's careful guidance, her hands steady despite the enormous weight of what she was about to do. She had decided against hiding, against fighting Gordon quietly behind closed doors, against allowing anyone else to control how her story would finally be told. Instead, she planned to walk into that boardroom and speak the truth herself, clearly and without shame, before Gordon ever had the chance to twist it into something ugly. Grace stood beside her, reviewing final details one last time. "Once you speak, there is no taking it back," she reminded her gently. "The story may spread beyond this room, regardless of how carefully we manage it afterward." "I know," Vivian replied calmly. "But I would rather it spread as my own truth than as his weapon." At exactly 9 o'clock, Vivian walked into the boardroom, where 12 board members, including Gordon Blake, already sat waiting around the long, polished table. Gordon offered her a thin, confident smile as she took her seat at the head of the table, clearly believing he still held the advantage of surprise. "Before we begin today's agenda," Gordon said smoothly, rising slightly from his chair, "I believe there is an important matter regarding corporate transparency that this board urgently needs to address." "Actually," Vivian interrupted calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "I would like to speak first, if the board will allow me a few minutes before we proceed to any other business." The room fell silent, several board members exchanging curious glances, sensing immediately that something unusual was unfolding. Vivian stood slowly, meeting each set of eyes around the table with steady composure. "Many years ago, before this company existed, I survived a serious incident during a business partnership that ended badly. I was seriously injured by a partner who could not accept losing control over a company we had built together. The experience left me with a permanent physical scar, one I have carefully hidden for over a decade, along with everything surrounding that difficult chapter of my life." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such direct honesty. Gordon's confident expression faltered slightly, his carefully planned reveal suddenly stripped of its intended power. "I understand that certain individuals within this room," Vivian continued, her gaze shifting briefly toward Gordon, "have recently invested considerable time and resources attempting to uncover this story, likely intending to use it as leverage against my leadership. I am here today to remove that leverage entirely, by sharing the truth myself, on my own terms, without shame or apology." She paused, allowing her words to settle fully across the silent room. "What happened to me years ago does not define my ability to lead this company. If anything, surviving it, rebuilding afterward, and creating something successful from nothing despite that experience proves exactly the strength and resilience this company has always benefited from. I will not allow fear, or anyone seeking personal advantage, to twist my history into a weakness." The room remained silent for several long moments, the weight of her words settling heavily around the table. Finally, one of the senior board members, a respected woman who had supported Vivian since the company's earliest days, spoke firmly. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "This board's confidence in your leadership remains entirely unchanged. If anything, it has only grown stronger today." Several other members nodded in quiet agreement, their earlier uncertainty replaced by renewed respect. Gordon, sensing his plan collapsing entirely before him, attempted weakly to redirect the conversation toward vague concerns about liability and risk, but the momentum in the room had already shifted decisively against him. By the end of the meeting, it became clear that Gordon's quiet campaign against Vivian had backfired entirely, exposing his own questionable motives, rather than damaging her reputation. Within weeks, facing mounting pressure from fellow board members uncomfortable with his methods, Gordon quietly resigned from his position, leaving the company entirely. News of Vivian's story eventually reached beyond the boardroom, exactly as she had expected, though this time framed entirely through her own words rather than a twisted narrative designed to weaken her. Major news outlets covered her decision to speak openly, praising her courage and resilience, painting her not as a victim, but as a powerful example of survival and quiet strength. In the weeks that followed, Vivian used her renewed public platform to launch a new initiative within her company, focused on supporting employees who had experienced difficult personal circumstances, offering resources, counseling, and workplace protections she wished had existed for herself many years earlier. Daniel watched proudly from a distance as Vivian's story unfolded publicly, admiring the quiet courage it had taken for her to finally release years of carefully guarded fear. Their relationship, built slowly through honesty and patience, continued deepening steadily, no longer shadowed by secrets or unspoken tension. He was no longer simply the maintenance technician who had accidentally witnessed something private one late night. He had become someone Vivian trusted completely, someone who had earned her confidence not through position or power, but through simple, consistent honesty. Months later, on a warm evening in early summer, Daniel sat proudly in the audience of Mia's school recital, watching his daughter perform a small role in the year's final showcase. Beside him sat Vivian, dressed simply, her shoulder no longer hidden beneath layers of careful clothing, comfortable at last in her own skin. When Mia spotted them both from the stage, she waved excitedly, her face lighting up with pure joy at seeing two familiar faces smiling back at her. Vivian reached quietly for Daniel's hand as the performance began, and he held it gently in return, both of them watching Mia with equal pride and warmth. For years, Vivian had believed strength meant standing entirely alone, hiding every scar, every fear, every piece of her story that did not fit the image of an untouchable, powerful woman. Yet sitting there quietly beside Daniel, watching a little girl who had already taught her so much about resilience and joy, she finally understood that true strength had never required hiding at all. It only required the courage, eventually, to be fully seen.